Turn off your lights. Make sure your doors and windows are locked. Things are about to get spooky. Vampirithus by BloodySpaghetti. The old one brought his grandchild to the seaside cave on a dreadful, stormy winter night. This cave was special because a god had taken residence there, according to legend. The master of the oceans in a corporeal form. A cruel and bestial thing, as dark and vicious as the depths themselves, fickle and turbulent as the seas at heart. An abyssal predator concealing his lust for destruction and chaos under an anthropomorphic facade crafted by his swarms of tentacled appendages. No one had seen the god himself, merely a statue placed there by the old one all those years ago. None dared question the validity of the tales, for the seas were treacherous, and that was enough to prove his existence. Standing before the statue of this divinity, the old one placed a clawed hand on his grandchild's shoulder, asking the youth, "My lamb, are you ready to become the savior of our world?" The little child could only nod in acceptance. He knew his destiny was one of thankless greatness. He also knew the road to his purpose in life was full of unimaginable suffering. Year after year, he watched the old one repeat the same ritual with his 6 siblings. Again and again, he watched his brothers and sisters save the universe from the wrath of their terrible lord. Good fortune blessed their family with a duty, a truly wonderful duty to the world. By 13 years of age, the boy knew he wasn't long for this world. All his siblings who had reached that age had to be offered as a willing sacrifice to the Lord. An innocent life was to be given away to salvage the world. "If so, let us save this world, my beautiful lamb," proclaimed the old one with a wide grin on his face. Tightly gripping his cane, he swung it at the boy, hitting him hard across the face. The child fell onto the rocky surface below, spitting blood and crying out in pain. "Did you just moan?" the old man berated. "Even your 2 sisters did not moan like that." His hand raised again into the air. A thunderclap echoed across the cave as the cane struck flesh again. Then again and again, each blow harder than the one before, each crack of the wooden crane almost loud enough to silence the agonizing cries of torment rumbling across the cave. "Who would have thought that you, the last of my seed, the one who was supposed to be perfect, would be the weakest one of all?" The old one sneered, beating into his grandchild repeatedly with a sadistic hatred, guiding each blow in a remarkable precision meant to prolong the torture for as long as humanly possible. The boy, curled up in a fetal position, could barely hear himself think over the repeated waves of ache washing over his body. There was no point in protesting his innocence. There was no point in even uttering any syllables. He knew his body was no longer his own. It now belonged to the gods and their priest, his grandfather. He didn't want to defend his assigned adulthood. He could no longer control his mouth or throat. Nothing was his in this world anymore. Nothing but an onslaught of indescribable pain. Finally satisfied with the ritualistic abuse he inflicted, the old one, covered in sweat and blood and frothing at the mouth like a rabid animal, collapsed onto his grandchild. turning the youthful husk, now covered in black and blue with stains of red all over, onto its back. The old one picked up a sharp stone from the ground and slammed it hard into the child's chest with an ecstatic glee. He slammed the stone again and again until the flesh and the bone caved in on itself, leaving a gap wide enough to push his hand inside the child. "Ah, there it is, the source of all my joy," the animal cried out. Its hand slid into the boy's chest. The youth weakly coughed, barely hanging on to life. He could hardly tell apart his monstrous grandfather from the surrounding darkness and cold. Everything turned even dimmer once the bloody hand came out of his chest again. The monster held out its hand in triumph, clutching the child's yet beating heart. Blood from the exposed organ dripped onto the youth's pale lips as everything vanished into the void, even the bizarrely satisfying smirk on his grandfather's face. The filicide of his last remaining grandchild had yet to satisfy his hunger for vile and pain. The demise of the one he had forced to behold as he snuffed the light from the eyes of their kin repeatedly did not satisfy his thirst for the obscene. Still hungering for more, the subhuman mortal shoved the little heart into his throat, swallowing it whole. The taste of human flesh further enticed his madness, forcing him to sink his yellow, rotting teeth into the infantile's carcass. Intoxicated with the fairest properties of his preferred wine, the old beast failed to notice as the ground shook violently beneath him. His tongue lapped the marrow out of the shattered thigh bone when the statue of his beloved god collapsed onto him, crushing his lower half and exposing his crimes. Countless little bones lay hidden inside the rubble. The vampire's pleas for help went unanswered as he withered under the weight of his creation. The cannibalistic beast was at the mercy of the heavens, but his god knew no kindness. He prayed between sheep-like bleats of anguish for a quick end. He begged for a piece of the cave to crush him to death once the ground shook again. But no such salvation would come. Tears streamed down his sunken features as the waves rose with boiling fury, for he knew his god had abandoned him. The old one desperately attempted to escape his punishment by throwing a stone at the cave ceiling, hoping it would fall on his head, killing him. And yet the forces above kept casting the stone away until it was too late. And the vengeful wrath of the gods brought down a deluge to pull the old ghoul and his blasphemous temple into the bottom of the abyss and away from sight. The father of the sweetest, most beautiful girl in town told me to have her back home from our date by 9 p.m. sharp. He never specified how much of her, though. The Puppeteer by Kahlil Worrell. Sarah Mitchell had always considered her husband, Agent David Mitchell, to be a man of order, intellect, and reason. His world was one of clear-cut facts, analyzed evidence, and unshakable logic. There was a comfort in that, in the way he could always separate emotion from investigation, shield them from the chaos his work often entailed. So, when she discovered an unmarked file tucked away in his office drawer one evening, a file he had never mentioned, she was intrigued. The file's surface was worn, the manila edges frayed as though it had passed through countless hands before finding its way to her. The label, in faded black ink, read, Re-101-The Puppeteer. It was a title that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine, though she could not yet explain why. Curiosity tugged at her like a child pulling on a sleeve, and Sarah, usually cautious, couldn't resist. She opened the folder. At first glance, it looked like just any other case file. Testimonies, photographs, surveillance reports, nothing she hadn't seen David shift through countless times before. Yet something was different. A palpable heaviness filled the air as her eyes began scanning the contents. The first document was a brief report on a nameless victim, the identification redacted. What struck Sarah immediately was the way the incident was described. The victim had discovered an old photograph in a forgotten trunk in the attic of their childhood home. In the faded sepia image, a man stood with a puppet dangling from strings in his hand. But the puppet was not what had disturbed them. It was the man. His face was smudged, indistinct blur, as though someone had intentionally obscured it from view. It was the kind of blur that didn't make sense in an old photograph. The face wasn't out of focus, it was deliberately hidden, as if a dark cloud of ink had seeped into the paper itself, making the figure seem both part of the image and not. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she continued reading. What had begun as a simple discovery quickly descended into a walking nightmare. The nameless victim had reported that the photograph seemed to change every time they looked at it. At first, it was subtle, just a shift in the light or the puppet's angle. But soon, the puppet appeared to move on its own, its position different each time they returned to the image. Then came the hallucinations. Dark, distorted figures seen in every corner of their vision, voices in the dead of night, whispers they couldn't quite decipher. And the dreams of strings attaching to their limbs, pulling them in unnatural, jerking movements, as though they had become a marionette in the hands of some unseen master. The report ended abruptly. No conclusion, no final notes, just a single cryptic sentence. Victim is no longer responsive. Sarah's fingers trembled as she flipped the page. Her eyes found the next entry, another victim, a young woman this time. Similar circumstances. She had found a drawing of a puppet, half torn and crumpled inside an old book she purchased at a flea market. Like the first victim, it began with strange occurrences, items in her apartment shifting positions, shadows that didn't belong to anyone, and always the puppet, its twisted wooden limbs and painted eyes staring, unblinking. The nightmares came next. The woman had described the sensation of being controlled, her body moving against her will. She awoke with bruises around her wrists and ankles, deep purple marks that resembled the impressions of tight pulling strings. As Sarah read, her chest tightened. This was no ordinary case. It was as though the entry, whatever it was, thrived on more than just fear. It fed on control, on the act of manipulating its victims until they were no longer their own. Each case followed the same eerie pattern. First contact was an image, whether a photograph, drawing, or even a sculpture, triggering the descent. And once the victim was touched by the puppeteer's influence, there was no escape. Sarah felt a growing unease settling in her stomach. The room had become noticeably colder. She glanced at the window. It was closed. She hadn't noticed before how still the house was. No hum of the refrigerator, no distant murmur of the TV. Nothing but the sound of her own shallow breathing. She reached the last few pages of the file. One final report caught her attention. This victim was different. Not just a random bystander, but an investigator. A seasoned agent working for a covert agency known as the APE, the Apocalypse Prevention Enterprise. The agent's testimony was more detailed than the others, filled with critical observations. They had been assigned to investigate the origins of the puppeteer case after several unexplained disappearances. The agent's notes were meticulous, charting their own mental unraveling as they dug deeper. They had obtained a photograph, much like the others, and described feeling drawn to it, as if something beyond their understanding had compelled them to stare. Soon, they too began to suffer the symptoms: hallucinations, insomnia, the feeling of being watched by something unseen. But unlike the others, they had one final observation. The entity is not bound to the image itself. It transcends it. It enters through the mind. Once you see it, once you acknowledge its existence, it knows you. Sarah's pulse raced. The words felt like a warning, meant for anyone foolish enough to read too far. Yet, she couldn't stop. Her eyes flickered down the page, hungry for more answers, for something that would explain the strange dread now gripping her. The report ended with the agent's disappearance. No trace of them was ever found. Just as Sarah was about to close the file, something slipped from between the pages, a photograph. Her heart lurched. It was a picture of the puppeteer. She stared at it, transfixed. The man stood in the shadows, holding the puppet in one hand, its limp wooden limbs hanging lifeless. But just like in the other reports, the man's face was a smudged blur. She felt the room shift, as though the very walls were pulled inwards, enclosing her in a tightening grip. The temperature plummeted further, her breath now visible in the air. Suddenly, a sensation crawled up her spine, a cold, creeping awareness that she was no longer alone. Sarah's eyes darted to the edge of the room, to the corners where the shadows seemed to gather unnaturally thick. The photograph fell from her hands, landing face up on the floor. In the silence, the ticking of the clock grew deafening, each second pounding in her ears. She bent down to pick up the photograph, but hesitated. Something was wrong. The puppet. It had moved. Its head was now turned ever so slightly, looking directly at her. Sarah's breath hitched. She jerked upwards, eyes wide, heart hammering in her chest. Her instinct was to flee, to leave the file, the photograph, the room, everything. But her legs refused to move. Her mind whirled. Had she seen it? Really seen it move? Then she remembered the warning. She glanced at the file's cover again. This time, the words in bold at the top seemed to scream to her. Do not open without official APE protective eyewear. Her stomach dropped. It was too late. She had opened it, she had seen it, and now it had seen her. The room dimmed as the shadows lengthened, closing in, and Sarah felt the unmistakable pull of invisible strings tightening around her wrist. She wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't understand why my husband's hands were so shaky while serving me another glass. But his eyes only widened when I drank the glass full of bleach again, then asked for more. And with that, our time together is coming to an end. If you have a story you'd like me to narrate, whether true or fictional, you can send it to me 3 different ways, through my subreddit, email, or website. All the links are down below, as well as the links to these stories as well. I would also like to thank the writers who let me read their stories this evening. We started with a story that definitely did not end up how I expected when I first read that title. An old man and his family that worship an old, evil ocean god that need to sacrifice themselves to keep the world turning, but it turns out, no, he just wants to feed on his own kin and enjoys the pain he causes. I truly loved how it ended. Got his just desserts, just wish the little boy didn't have to die first. And a good reminder of why curiosity killed the cat is such a good saying. Next time, well, I guess not for her, someone will read all the file before opening it. I actually recorded this one live, which I'm trying to do a bit more now, and someone said that it gave them SCP vibes, and I completely agree. Problem is, SCP has to be open source, so anything you write can be used by anyone else. So there is downsides to it, but it can be really fun to add to other people's stories as well. I guess that cat got killed this time, and hopefully the husband figures out what happened. Now, hit that like button and make sure it feels it. If you're new, please subscribe and turn that pretty little bell to all notifications so you never miss a single upload. And of course, leave me a comment. Tell me what you think, what kind of stories you like in the future, anything like that. I love to read your guys' comments. If you're listening on the podcast and are able to, please leave a review as well as a comment. If you'd like to help this channel and podcast grow, please share it with anyone who might enjoy it. It helps quite a bit. If you'd like to help in a more financial way, just like these lovely people on screen right now, I do have Patreon and memberships, where for $1 a month you get early access and a few other bonuses. If you'd like to do a more one-time thing, I have PayPal, Buy Me a Coffee, and Super Thanks. As always, none of this will ever be expected, just always appreciated. I really love narrating these stories, and I'm just so happy you guys are here to hear them. So, as always, thank you guys. Sleep tight, and don't let 42 bite.